it's now time for a very cool lecture, and one that I'm really excited about, because we're going to talk about how to implement CSS animations. So, as I said, you're going to learn in this lecture how to create CSS animations using the keyframes add rule and the animation property. So what we're trying to do is this animation that we're going to see here. So watch carefully at these two parts here of our H1 element. So this one fades in and it also moves in from the right side here, right? And this one moves in from the left side and it also fades in. So let's take a look again. So that's it. This one fades from the left and this one fades in from the right. So let's code these animations in CSS, and it's really cool, believe me. Now there are generally two types of animations in CSS. The first one, which is also the easier one, is to just use the transition property and then change the properties that we want to animate on an event, like when we hover the element. And I'm sure that you're familiar with this method, and if not, don't worry, because we're going to use in the next lecture. But what we're doing this lecture is a bit different and actually a bit more advanced and cooler, because these animations allow us to put more options, and so they're a bit more complex. So let me show you how it works. So we start by creating an animation that looks exactly like we want it to be. And in order to do that, we use the keyframes add rule. So we write add keyframes. Add keyframes, and then we give the animation a name. And we're going to start with the first part, so the heading primary main, which remember moves in from the left. So I'm going to call this animation move in left. Okay. And now in here I can specify what I want to happen in each moment of time of the animation. So we start with 0%, which is before the animation actually starts. So this can also be called the start. And then the finish is at 100%, which is when the animation finishes. But we can put other steps here in the middle. So for example, we want something to happen at the moment where the animation is at 80%, for example. And we could do 50, we could do 36, we could do any percentage here that we want. But let's just start with 0%, so the initial state, and then 100%, which is the final state. So how do we want the element to look like before it starts to move in? First, we want it to be invisible, right? So what we can do is opacity 0. So at the beginning of our animation, the opacity will be 0, and at the end, of course, we want it to be back to 1. So opacity 1. So that's one of the properties that we're animating here. Now, for the browser performance, it's best to only ever animate two different properties. One is opacity, which is the one that we're using here, and the other one is the transform property. That's what the browsers are optimized for these two properties. But with transform, we can do a whole lot. And so it's everything that we need actually to make all these cool animations that you can imagine. So remember that the element comes in from the left. So where do we want it to be on the beginning, before the animation actually starts? We want it to be more in the left than in the beginning, right? And so we can use transform and then translate x. And why x? Well, because we want it to animate in the x direction. So remember, the x direction is like this, so from left to right, and the y direction, or axis, goes from the top to the bottom. So we want to translate it in the x direction, and we want it to be more in the left than in the beginning. And so it's a negative value. So let's say 100 pixels minus, okay? Because remember that the direction goes from left to right. So a positive value means it goes to the right, and negative value means it goes to the left. So just like in basic mathematics. Alright, but moving back here, how do we want it to be when we are at 100%? We simply want it to look the way that it looks now, right? And so we say translate 0. And why 0? Well, because if we translate it 0, then it's going to look exactly the way that it looks right now. Makes sense? So this is the very basic animation, just with the initial and the final state. So let's now actually apply this animation. And so for an animation to work, there are only two properties that we have to really specify, which are called animation name. So an animation name, which is the name of the animation we just wrote, and so it's move in left. Move in left. And then the animation duration. Okay, animation duration. And so this is the time that the animation should take. Just to see it in the beginning, let's put 3 seconds. So it takes a longer time so we can see if it's actually working. Can actually put 5 seconds, then it takes even a bit longer. So these are the only properties that are required for an animation to work. Now there are a lot more properties, but I'm going to show them to you in a second. For now, let's just see if this actually works. And so we need to reload our page now. And yeah, you see it's working. Great, amazing, right? This is really fantastic. So let me play it again. So it's happening really slow because we specified it for 5 seconds, but we can then change that. Now let me play the original one again. And you see that in this version it actually first goes a bit in that direction and then it moves back, right? Let me play it again. So it's this small movement in this direction. So how do you think we are going to do that? What do you think? And that's right, we're going to use this 80% here. So what we can say here is that we want it to be, at this point, translate x to be 20 pixels, for example. Because remember, if we're specifying a positive value here, it will go to the right side. So the final position is 0, the initial position is a lot more to the left, and then this intermediate position, let's say, is a bit more to the right. So let's check it out. And yeah, nice. That's really nice. Let's just put it a bit slower. Now that we have this animation really going on already. So just in 1 second. Alright, maybe that's a bit too much. I will leave it just at 10 pixels. Great. So this already works. Now I told you that there are other properties for animations that we can also specify. So let's take a look at them. The first one is that we can set a delay. So animation delay, let's say 3 seconds. And so now before this animation starts to play, it will first wait 3 seconds. So let's take a look. All right, so here we go. So it waited 3 seconds. So 1, 2, 3, and there it goes. Okay, so that's the animation delay. Now we can also do something else. I'm actually going to comment out this part that we don't want, because this is just to show you, but I will not delete it so that you can still see it, because its properties can be very useful sometimes. Okay, another one that we can do is an animation count. Animation iteration count. So if we set this to, let's say, 3, then the animation will simply happen 3 times. So let's check that out as well. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, but we also don't want this one to happen, so I'm putting it here in the commented code. And then one that is actually quite important, which is the animation timing function. So this is a function which defines how the animation will proceed. So how fast or how slow these parameters that we specified here happen over time. And there are different built-in animation functions, for example, ease out. So ease out, for example, let's take a look at it now. Probably going to look a bit similar, but there are different timing functions. So I already have this one here open. So we have ease, ease in, ease out, and then all of these built-in animation timing functions. So for example, with the ease in function, the animation will start slower and then accelerate over time. And with ease out, it's the opposite. So it will start faster and then it will become slower by the end. So this might sound a bit complicated, but we're going to look at animation timing functions again in another lecture. We're also going to look at this cubic Bezier function here, which basically allows us to write a custom function. So a custom timing function different from these predefined functions. And this can actually make all the difference in how the animation feels to the user. So we used, remember, ease out. So let's play it again. And this is how ease in, for example, looks like. So it was slower towards the beginning and then faster at the end. See? So at the end it happened a lot faster. So let's stick with ease out like we had at the beginning. Okay, and these are the most essential animation properties. There are actually more, but they are not really so important. You can take a look at them if you're really interested. So this is the move in left animation, but we can now also build the move in right. So let's just copy this part of the code and call it move in right. So how do you think this one will look like? So I want you to pause the video now and try to change these values here so that the animation, instead of going in from the left, it goes in from the right. So take a second and try that out. Alright, did you manage to do it? Well, let's see. What do you think is the most logical way of doing it? So all we have to do is to actually remove this minus here and put it here. And why is that? Because, as I mentioned, this 100 pixels here, if it's a plus value, it moves the element to the right, because it goes forward in the x direction. And so it's the opposite as we had before, and then the same thing, of course, here. Because now we want it to move a little bit to the left before it goes back to its original position at 0. Right? Okay, so now all we have to do is to add it here. Now, instead of specifying all of these properties here one by one, animation name, duration, timing, function, delay, etc., we can simply use the shorthand property and just say animation. And so we can put all of these together, and then CSS will figure out what means what. So move in right over the duration of 1 second and with the ease out function. And that should work now. So let's take a look. And yep, so it's exactly what we had before. Great. Now maybe you have already noticing that here in the end, take a look here at this text, right before the animation ends. You will probably see a little shake here, okay? So let's take a close look at the end. There it was. So it moved a little bit like to the top. Did you see it? Let's take a look again. So you saw it moving? So it moved a little bit, so it's a bit shaky. And sometimes this happens in animations. And to be honest, no one really knows actually why this happens. But we have a fix for this. So there is something that we can do. And what we have to do in this case is to simply declare the backface visibility property. Backface visibility and set it to hidden. So the entire heading primary element, because you see that actually this entire element is what moves on this animation. So it's a bit shaky, and it's the entire heading primary element. This backface visibility property determines if the back part of an element, when we transform it, is visible or hidden for the user. So imagine we have an element and we rotate it 180 degrees. So it would be logical that we then see the back part of that element, right? But if we use backface visibility hidden, then that back part, so that part that's behind the element, let's say, that part actually gets hidden. Now in this case, we're not rotating anything, we're not doing anything like that, but we still use this fix here, like this hack, in order to fix this little shaking that we see in the animation. And again, no one really seems to know why the shaking happens and why this fixes it, but as long as it works, it's okay. And so now let's take a look at it again and look really closely here, really close, and it's gone, right? It's no longer shaking and everything appears to working just fine. And so yeah, that's how animations work. So this is a really powerful thing. And we could actually go really crazy with this. Imagine we would do something like put a 60% here and say transform at this point should be rotate. Let's say just something like 120 degree. So degree is a unit we use for rotations. And we can also say that in the beginning it should be rotate minus 50 degrees. So just some random numbers here to try out to see what happens, okay? Not really sure how it's going to look like. So it's this crazy thing, you see? Let me play it again to you. So this is just something crazy, just to show you the power that we have here with these animations. To make it a bit more realistic, let's say we rotate it 360 degrees. Well, that didn't really work, but let's try 180 degrees. And now it should do something. Yeah. So it starts just right, and it rotates until 70%, I believe, or was it? Yeah, 60%, and then it went back to the initial position because we didn't specify anything here. We could actually put this one here as well. So we're just playing around here with the numbers. You don't really have to follow this. I just wanted to show you that there's not really a limit. So this actually looked the same. Let me try it again, 180 this time. And well, I guess it didn't work exactly because we have to put it here in this step as well. So let's put it here as well, just to play around a little bit. And here we go. So let me close this one and of course delete this little thing that we did here, because this is just what we want it to be. You saw I selected two things at the same time. You saw that? I'm sure you can do that as well in your code editor, and sometimes it's really handy. So for example, I have this transform. If I want to select the next one, I just have to hit Command D here in this Visual Studio Code. But the same thing works in Atom or brackets or whatever. So if I just hit Command D and D and D, then I have all of these transforms selected, and you see that the cursor is blinking here. And then I can delete, and I can write something else if I want. And it's happening in all these places at the same time. All right? So this is not really CSS, but it's a nice trick that you can use in your text editor. Also, I can put multiple cursors just by clicking and then hitting Command or Control, maybe on Windows, and then just keep clicking and it will add multiple cursors all over the place. You see, like this. And now if I start writing A, B, C, it's writing A, B, C everywhere. So in this case, it's not really useful, but you can do it. And sometimes it's pretty useful to change multiple things at the same time, okay? And since we're talking about text editors, I'm sure that yours also has this functionality here, which is called Minimap, which shows us a very small version of our code, so we can use this to drive around in our code or to move around. So imagine we want to go to the beginning, and then we just need to click here, and then it goes exactly where we want to. Or imagine that I'm working here, and I want to go to the animations, and here I can see that these here look like the animations, and I just have to click here, and then I'm here at the place where I wrote the animations. So instead of scrolling all the way up and down, imagine we have 500 lines of CSS, then this becomes really useful. And so once again, this is also in your code editor. You just have to turn it on if it's not turned on by default. Only if you like it, of course. But I think it's pretty helpful sometimes. Okay, and that was the goal that I had for this lecture. So I showed you how animations work with the keyframes add rule, and I showed you that we can build really complex animations with this. Oh, but before we stop, I can actually show you something else, which is imagine that we don't just want this to happen when we load the page. So imagine we want this animation to happen when we hover, for example, something. So let's say we want this animation to happen to the logo when I hover it. So let's say logo, hover. And so you see, I can actually use this animation here in multiple places. So I can just define move in right in one place and then use it all over the place, okay? And so now this will only happen as soon as I hover. So let's reload this. And here we go. You see, there it is again. So this animation does not only have to happen with the page load like we have these ones here. See, these ones are on page load, but this one is on hover. Okay, but this was just to show you. We don't really want it to be here, right? Okay, but this was now really all I had to show you for this lecture. So let's now move on to the next video. See you there. We're almost done building the first section of our page. But what's missing is this cool animated button that I showed you right at the beginning. So let's go build that. And by coding up this button, you will learn techniques that are going to be useful in countless situations in the future. So you're going to learn what pseudo elements and pseudo classes are and why they are important, how and why to use the after pseudo element, and how to build a creative hover animation effect using the transition property. So this lecture is probably going to be rather long, but I promise you it's going to be totally worth it. So the button that I'm talking about is this one here. And so it has this nice effect, you see, where it looks like it's getting bigger, and then in the end it fades out after like half a second or something, you see? So this is what we're going to build. So it moves up a little bit and creates this shadow beneath it. And so it looks like it's moving up in direction to the user. So let's check it again. So it's like it's really moving up. And that's why the shadow then appears. Now look what happens when we click it. So it goes down a little bit, and the shadow also disappears a little bit, as if we were really pushing it towards the page. Want to see it again? So we hover it, it elevates, and then as we click it, it looks like it's going back down. And you can see it because it moves down and because the shadow gets a little bit smaller. So you see? There it is. Then it actually moves down, but let's see it again. And there it is. Right? So let's first code up that part where this functionality happens, and then later we're going to care about this white part that looks like it's like flying out or something. It's growing bigger and bigger and then disappears. So back to our markup here. Remember that I was saying that we were going to add something here to this text box. And what I mean is, of course, this button. So the button will be an anchor element, so A, for now with an href of nothing, so leading to nothing, which is this hash symbol. And then of course we need to give it some class. And I'm going to call it as usual button, but at the same time I'm giving it another class calling button white. Because we're going to have multiple buttons on a page, some will be white and some will be green, but most of the functionality is the same, only the color changes. And so I'm going to put the styles about the color here in this class, and the stuff that doesn't change from the white to the green button in this button class. So we've done this before, at least in my other HTML course, and so this should be nothing new to you. It's just a good practice. Alright, and the text which we have on this link, on this button, is discover our tours. Just like this. And so let's now start styling the button element down here. So you see our CSS file is getting rather long. We're already at 121 lines here, but don't worry, we're gonna think about architecture and all that stuff a bit later. So for now, in this section, we're just focusing on getting this code ready here and getting this header element ready. And we're gonna think about organizational aspects of our code a bit later. So with this, we select the button element, but since it's a link, I'm sure you already know that we should do it like this. All right, and what is this? So this here is a pseudo class. It's the link pseudo class. And pseudo classes are a special state of a selector. So this link here is the state of the button selector. So like when a user hovers an element, or when the checkbox is clicked, or if we want to select a last child, and many other possibilities. So we use pseudo classes to style elements under a special condition. And it's a very important concept that we're going to use all the time. So the link is a special state of a selector when it is an anchor element. So it functions as a link. Now there's also the visited state. So button visited. So this is the state when the user has already clicked on the button once before and then sees the button again. So that's the visited state. And I'm sure that you know that, for example, if we don't style a link at all, it will appear blue in the beginning, and then once we click on it once, when we see it again, then it will be purple. So that's the default styling of links in most of the browsers. Now we don't want this. We want the visited state to look exactly like the link state, so the normal state of our links. And so we just put them together. Now the first thing we're going to do is to say that we want the text to be uppercase, text transform uppercase. We want there to be no text decoration. Let's actually take a look so we can see what exactly we want to change. So here we go. So we don't want, of course, this color, and we don't want this underline. So let's get rid of it. So text decoration, and I'm sure you already know all of these. That's why these properties that are not really new to you, I'm not really explaining what they're doing, okay? So none, and then the text we want to be gray. Now remember that we're going to have multiple colors for the button. And so in the white button, the text will be this dark gray, but in the green button, it will probably be white. And so that's something that we have to do in this external class. So let me already create that actually. So it's called button white. And so here we're going to have a background color of white, of course, background color, and you saw I did this trick where I just write a couple of letters and then the text editor figures out which property I want. And this way I have to type less code. So white, as we saw already, FFF, and the color should be 777, as we already used before. Now we also want some padding around the button, of course, so let's specify that as well. And once again, I'm sure you're already familiar with how the shorthand property of padding works. So we can specify only one value, and then it will apply everywhere, so top, bottom, left, and right. Or we can also write two values. Then the first one will be for top and bottom, and the second one will be for left and right. So let's say 15 pixels and 40 pixels. So now we have a padding at the top and at the bottom of 15 pixels and left and right 40 pixels. And we could also write four numbers. Then the first one would be top, the second would be right, the third one would be the bottom, and the fourth one would be for the left side. Okay, now check this out, but I will tell you already that it's not going to work as expected, because it's occupying here this space on the top of this other text where it shouldn't. That's because it's right now an inline element. So this button here is right now an inline element because it's simply text, but we should display it as an inline block. In this way, the box model works on this element as if it was just a normal block element, okay? So we should always do this if we want to give some paddings or some heights or width to elements, okay? Now another thing that I noticed here, let me just refresh this. So now it has its own space. Another thing that we want is this actually to be here in the middle of this box, right? So how could we do that? How could we achieve this button to be in the center of the box? Do you think we should use absolute positioning or transforms like we did before? Well, I don't think so, because that would really be overkill. It would be way too much for this very simple problem. So this is an inline block element, and so it's treated as if it was text. And so if it's text and we want it to be at the center of this box, all we have to do is to set the text box, I believe it's called, exactly, it's text box. All we have to do is to set its text align property to center. And that's it. So now it's going to center the text that is inside of the box, including, of course, the button. So just to be sure, yeah, here it goes. And since we're here, let's also add here some white space between this heading element and the button. So how do we do white space? Exactly, we use the margin property. And in this case, we just want margin at the bottom. So we say margin bottom, and let's say we want 60 pixels. All right, I'm not going to check it right now. We're going to check it later on. So this is the link and the visited state. Now let's take care actually of the hover state. So button hover. So another pseudo class to select a different and special state of this element. So what do we want to happen? Remember, the first thing is for this element to move up. So how can we do that? We use transform, such as we did before. So you see, transform is something really, really important. It's an extremely important property that we're using all the time to create cool and modern effects where elements move around or even rotate or stuff. So transform is really important. So now we want to translate it, and we want it to move up. So which direction is that? X or Y? And it's right, it's direction Y, of course. And we want it to move up, so we use a negative value. And that's because in CSS, the epsilon axis moves from the top to the bottom. So it's like from the top to the bottom. And if we want to move up, we have to go the other way around, and so it's negative. So to go up, it's a negative value, so negative -3 pixels in this case. So that's for the hover. Now when we clicked it, remember, it looked a bit different. So it's the active state. Remember, when we click an element, then that's called the active state. So it's the active pseudo class. So remember what it looked like when we clicked it? Again, it's a translate because, again, it moved. And this time we're only moving it 1 pixel up. So this 1 pixel up, so this -1 pixel is in relation to the initial state, so the link state, not to the hover. So it's not -1 pixel in relation to the hover state, but it's always here related to the initial link state, okay? So let's check that out. So the margin is there, and we hover, So it goes up. No animation so far, but it goes up. And when we click, it goes down a bit. Right? So cool. Now all we have to do is to animate this and then also add these shadows. But first let's actually add the rounded corners. So border radius. And here we can put a really high number, like let's say even 100 pixels or something. And then what it will do is to simply shape it like this here on the edges. So if you put 200 or 500 pixels, it will all still be the same, okay? So now all we have to do is this small animation. And so remember that in the last lecture I said that there are two types of animations. The first one is to simply use the transition property, which is the easier one, and the more complex one is the method that we used, which was to really specify the steps of the animations with the keyframes add rule. Now in this case that's not necessary at all. All we have to do is to use the transition property, transition, and now we have to just specify which properties we want to animate. And if we're not really sure, or if we don't want to write them out, we can simply say all. So in this case, all the properties are enabled to be animated. Then we can also specify a time that we want. Let's say we want 0.2 seconds. So this is already the shorthand version of the transition. So just like before here where we had a shorthand for animation, instead of writing out all of these properties, we do the same with transition. We just write all of these possibilities here in the same property as a shorthand because it's just easier. And so now the transform on the hover as well as on the active will be animated in relation to their initial state. And this is actually causes sometimes a lot of confusion as to why the transition property has to be on the initial state. But that's just how it works. So on the initial state, we say that there can be a transition basically on all the properties. And then on the hover, so here we say how it should look like in the hover state and in the active state, and then the animation is going to happen. So let's take a look at that. And yeah, here we go. So now it moves up and very nicely it moves down. Just like this. Okay, now all we have to do is to add the box shadow, and that's also when we do the hover. So box shadow, and so in the box shadow property we can specify a bunch of values. So the first one is the offset in the X direction. And since we don't want any shadow in the X direction, we only want it in the epsilon direction, we put a 0 here. Now in epsilon, which is the second one, we actually want some offset. So 10 pixels, let's say. So the shadow will be 10 pixels down. Then the third value is the blur that we want to see. And let's say 20 pixels, so we have a really high blur here. And this makes for a more blurry shadow, so it looks like we're further away. And so in the active part here, in the active box shadow, we're then going to reduce that blur, and then it looks like we're back closer to the page, okay? And here now, finally, we can put a color, so an RGBA in this case, because we want the color of the shadow to be transparent. So here we put it to black, complete black, and then let's just put a transparency value. So this is black, but not completely black, but only with a 20% opacity, in order to make it just a very subtle shadow and not all too visible. We want it to be really subtle, okay? Now you can play around then with different numbers to see how it's going to look like if you make it darker, if you make it less opaque. 20% I think is a good way to go. Now remember, when we click on a button, so when it's active, we want the shadow to look smaller, and so to give the impression that the button is closer to the page and so further away from the user. So let's decrease this here to 5, and then we also want it less blurred. So let's say 10 pixels here, okay? So I'm doing this from my experience, because I have a lot of experience by playing around with these values. So if this looks a bit So if this looks a bit like magic to you, then don't worry, it comes with practice. And so again, you should just play around with these numbers and take a look how things behave if you change the values, okay? Now let's just take a look. And yeah, so you see the shadow coming up, right? And now when we click it, it goes down like this. So we lose a bit of shadow, and it also becomes less blurry. Just to show you how it would look like with 1 pixel, for example, let's see. So you see there's a lot less blur now, right? But we want a little bit of blur to make it look more natural. And so let's put that 10 pixel that we had before. Okay, and with that we have the first part of the button ready. Now to build the second part of this button, which includes some more animation effects, just join me right in the next lecture. So let's now continue building our animated button. So this is the final page and the final button, and what we're missing here is this white part that looks like it zooms out to infinity when we hover, and it comes back when we hover out. You see? So this nice effect. It's not really necessary, of course, to add this, but it was a great opportunity to show you the power of CSS and of pseudo elements. So let me show you how we do it. So as I said, we're going to use pseudo elements. And pseudo elements allow us to style certain parts of elements. And for example, the after pseudo element that we're going to use adds like a virtual element right after the element that we're selecting. And we can then style that element. And so using this after pseudo element can be really powerful to do some cool effects. And once you master it, you're going to want to use it all the time. So let me just add the after pseudo element. So the trick here is to add an element that looks exactly like the button that we already have, but we put it behind the button. And when we hover out of the button, then this hidden pseudo element basically goes back behind the button. Okay? So let's see how we can do this. First, in order for an after pseudo element to actually appear on the page, we need to specify its content property. So that's always necessary. It doesn't matter what the content is, it can even be empty like we're going to do here, but we have to specify it, otherwise it's not going to appear. And the same thing with the display property. So we have to specify the display property. And in this case, we're going to say it's an inline block, because the button that we have is also an inline block. And so again, we want it to be exactly the same. We want it to look the same. So we want to have a height of 100%, and we want to have a width of 100% as well. And this works because the after pseudo element is basically treated like a child of the button. And so if we say that we want the height to be 100%, that's 100% of the width of the button. And so suppose that the button has 100 pixels of height and 50 pixels of width. And so this after pseudo element will have the exact same dimensions if we set it to 100%. Okay? Now the border radius should also be the same, 100 pixels, so something really big. And now we also want it to be white. But in order for it to be white, we actually should make another after pseudo element, but this time for the button right. So let's put it here, then after. Okay, and so background color should be white. Alright, now let's just see on our page if it actually shows up. So right now it still looks like it's part of our element, and so we should change that. So what we want to do, remember, is to put it behind our actual button. So how can we do that? And we use absolute positioning. So position, absolute, and then we just say it should be 0 from the top and 0 from the left. Now remember that this absolute positioning needs to have a reference. And the reference is the first element with the relative position that it can find. Now in this case it would be the header, because remember we did that before, but we don't want it to be the header. We want it to be hidden after the button. And so the reference should be the button. Therefore, what we have to do is to set the position property of the button to relative. All right. And so now it should be hidden behind the button. Now one more thing that we have to do is to set the z-index, and we will put it to -1. So remember, the z-index defines the position of the elements if they're one on top of another. And so this one has -1, and so it's definitely behind the button. Now since it's hidden, I cannot really show it to you on the page now, but we're going to see it in a little bit, all right? So when do we actually want to see it? We want to see it when we hover the button, right? So what we're going to do is to write it like this. And this may seem a bit complicated, but it's actually not. So when we hover the button, then we want some certain styles for the after pseudo element. So this looks a bit weird, but it makes totally sense. So this is an after pseudo element only when we have the button on the hover state, right? And what do we want to happen? We want it to be bigger, right? Remember? We want the element to grow and to fade out. And so what we first do is to use once again the transform property. And I told you it was really important, and so yeah, it is. This time we do a scale. So what scale does is to simply increase the element. So if we do scale 2, then it will appear double the size that it had before. So now we can actually check if it's working all right. So reload, and whoa, there it is. So this white part that you see outside here is the pseudo element that becomes visible as soon as we hover the button. Let's actually make it a different color here, like red, so just so that you can see the difference. And whoa, now it's everything red, but that's not a problem. For some reason the original button is also getting red, but we still can be sure the pseudo element is behind the button because we still can see the text, right? And so that means that the original button is still on top of the pseudo element. Okay, but let's put it back to white, where it was. And we don't want to scale it this much. So let's just say 1.5, okay? And we also want this to be animated just like before. So where do we have to put the transition property? Exactly, we do it on the initial state. In this case, the initial state is of course this after pseudo element. So we say transition, and again I'm going to use all here, and then use, like, let's say 0.4 seconds in this case. So here we had 0.2, but we want this one to take a little bit longer. Now what also happens is that the element actually fades out, right? So opacity 0. That's the trick for fading something out. It's going to opacity 0. We did that before in our other animation in the lecture before, and so here we're doing it again. So opacity 0 sets something to invisible basically. And so let's check out if it works already. Yeah, that's actually it. It's already working, right? It comes back. It goes out and it comes back. So really cool, right? Now we can make this a little bit better, because if you look closely at the top of the button, then you see that it looks really small. So the part that's fading out is like really small. Take a look. So let's do this a bit better. And actually with this I can show you that there are different scales. So scale without any x or epsilon here simply scales the entire element. But we can do scale x, and then that's how it's going to scale on the x direction, on the x-axis. And here we want to do 1.4. And now scale epsilon, as you can imagine, in the other direction. So let's put 1.6 here. So there are different scales, just like there are different translates or rotates or other functions that we can put here in the transform. So let's check it out. And yeah, so now it looks a bit better. So really cool. There's just one thing left here, because take a look here what happens when we load the page. You saw this? This came up moving from the button. So first we saw these two elements coming in like we coded before, and then the button came up from the button to this position. So let's very quickly code up another animation for that. And we're going to put it here after this one. Actually, I'm going to copy it because it's pretty similar. So move in, let's say bottom now, from the bottom. This time we don't need any 80% because it's just from one point to the other. And now I'm going to leave it to you to specify this here, what we should put here, okay? So pause the video and try to figure out how this should look like, okay? So, did you figure it out? How should the button be positioned right in the beginning before the animation starts? It should be a bit lower than its current position, right? Because it's moving in from the button to its original position. And so we can do translate epsilon this time and put something like 30 pixels in here. That's because remember, for the epsilon direction, it goes like this, so from top to bottom. So if we want to move it down, it's a positive value. All right, and let's now actually use this animation. Now again, there will be multiple buttons like this, but I only want this animation to happen on this particular button. And so what I'm going to do is to create a new class on the button. So button animated, and only this button will have this class. Okay, so let's put it here, button animated, and then in here I will put the animation. So animation, and I'm going to use the shorthand property that I showed you before, and now it's called move in bottom, and let's use a 0.5 second animation, and we're going to use an ease out this time. Okay, now plus what we're going to do is to have a delay. So we don't want to start it at the same time as the others. We want it to start slightly later. So maybe not 1 entire second, which is the animation time of the other two animations, but maybe just 75% of that. So 0.75 seconds. Okay, so I told you that we could put all of these values in the same animation property. So this is the animation name, the animation duration, the animation timing function, and the animation delay. So let's take a look at what happens here. Alright, so you saw that actually the button was visible before the animation happened. Let's take a look again. So it stays visible and then it starts. Now what could we do in order to prevent this? We could simply put these initial states on the button. But that would be highly impractical, right? Wouldn't make much sense. So there is another property related to animations, and this one is called animation fill mode. So animation fill mode, and now we can set it to backwards. And what this does is that it will automatically apply the styles of the 0% before the animation starts. So again, these styles will now be applied before the animation starts, simply by using the animation fill mode and set it to backwards. So pretty amazing, right? So it's really simple solution to this problem. And so let's try it again. And yep, so here it works. All right, and that's it for this lecture and actually for this section. So we've come a long way so far, and we already coded a bunch of really cool stuff, I think. We already have the header already completed. Only what's missing here is this navigation, but it's a bit too complex for now, so we're going to leave it for another time, okay? But for now, we've come far enough with this project that it's now time to show you a little bit how CSS actually works behind the scenes. So I have a couple of really great lectures coming up, which I spent a lot of time building for you, but they will be really insightful and helpful, I hope. So review what we just did in this section maybe, or you can just move on to the next one right now. Anyway, see you next time.